Our session today is going to look at the question of business innovation. And I have two story quotes to share first. 1894, in the publication of the London Times, it said, "In 50 years, every street in London will be buried under 9 feet of manure." The reasoning was that more horses are needed to remove the manure, and horses produce more manure. It was called the Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894. The supposed problem of excessive horse manure collecting in the streets was solved by the proliferation of cars, which replaced horses as the means of transportation in big cities. The term Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894 is often used to denote a problem which seems to be impossible to solve because it is being looked at from the wrong direction. Now, from that example of innovative thinking to this, and Jared Diamond is one of my favorite authors, and he wrote in his book Collapse the following: "A conservative outlook is understandable when one reflects on environmental fragility. People tend to become conditioned by their long history of experience to conclude that whatever change they tried to make, it was much more likely to make things worse than better. They might have said to themselves, 'We live in a fragile land. We know that our ways will allow at least some of us to survive. Don't ask us to change.' The values to which people cling most stubbornly under inappropriate conditions are those that were previously the source of their greatest triumphs over adversity. Decisions involve gambles because often one can't be certain that clinging to core values will be fatal, or conversely, that abandoning them will ensure survival. Success," he concludes, "depends on the courage to practice long-term thinking and to make bold, courageous, anticipatory decisions at a time when problems have become perceptible, but before they have reached crisis proportions." So I thought that those two different stories would be a good setup for this next session, which is being led by our great friend, Robert Marx. He's the president of the Samuels Foundation in New York, a frequent speaker at our annual conferences. He was one of our important facilitators at the World Opera Forum in Madrid, and he's a great friend. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rob Marx.
Thank you, Mark. It's really such a pleasure to be back at the Opera America conference, and I do want to thank Mark, and we should all thank the Opera America team, which is doing such an amazing job of keeping these wheels turning throughout this conference with so many people here, and a sold-out conference, no less. And I think part of Mark's very wise managerial instinct is to keep these things from being too conventional, and our marching orders for this panel were no exception to that. And I'm going to quote from Mark's opening statement yesterday, and we all know that opera has a very long history of creative and managerial innovation. But today, to quote Mark yesterday, "It is in the administrative area that creativity seems to have stalled." And for a management panel, that's certainly a provocation for our 7 provocateurs. Now, we all know that every company in this room is pushing as hard as possible under very difficult circumstances. And there is that rich history of management in opera. But when Mark and I talked about what this panel could be, we wondered if a lot of this constituency was really aware of one of the most influential examples of an American opera company completely reinventing itself in a crisis mode through some very courageous self-innovation. And it's the story of how the Metropolitan Opera survived the Great Depression in the 1930s, and it's still one of America's greatest examples of reinvention under crisis. So with Mark's encouragement, I'm going to give this is going to be a brief introduction about what happened to the Met, and it'll lead into our very contemporary examples that will be discussed here through the provocateurs. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on ancient history, And I almost apologize to Matthew because I'm sure there's an equivalent history at the San Francisco Opera. I'm just not as familiar with the history of your company as I am with the Met. A lot of people don't know that before 1932, the Metropolitan Opera was a purely commercial business. It was a for-profit entity. Its legal name was the Metropolitan Opera and Real Estate Company. That was the legal entity. And it was organized like a cooperative apartment house, where you don't own your apartment, you own shares in the corporation that owns the building. And the number of shares are set to what floor your apartment is on, what kind of view you have. And at the Metropolitan, the box holders owned the company. And the shares of stock were assigned according to the position of the box. So a center box on a lower floor had more stock assigned to it than a side box on an upper floor. And the stockholders were all expected, mandated, to provide an annual maintenance fee, like the rent on an apartment. And the collective maintenance fees, once they came in, that covered the operations of the building, it paid for the taxes and all of that. And because of low labor costs in those eras, if management had something approaching a sold-out house, that covered your production costs. So it was pretty much like a Broadway operation. And this formula of the stockholders covering the building and box office covering your production costs, the budget worked, and it played out that way for decades. Just as an example, in the Met's commercial days, it ran a profit every year, from 1908 to 1929. And the 1929-30 season opened with a 6-month full repertory schedule that was largely sold out in advance, and there was a reserve fund of $1 million, which was a lot of money in 1929. So they were rolling on, and then came the deluge of the stock market crash at the end of 1929. It took only 3 years for the Met to more or less collapse. By 1932, just 3 years later, 50% of the subscribers were gone, although, amazingly, the single ticket sales apparently were steady throughout the whole period. The season had been slashed from 6 months to just 16 weeks. The Met's biggest box office draws of that period, Beniamino Gigli and Maria Yaritza, both quit the company because the top per performance fee was slashed from $3,000 a night to $1,000 a night. And apparently a majority of the formerly wealthy box holders stopped paying their annual maintenance fees. And then finally, the $1 million reserve, about which the Met was so proud in 1929, it was completely wiped out by 1932 in covering the operating deficits. So by that date, the Met was pretty much bankrupt as an ongoing business, just like the opera companies in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in Boston, with the exception of San Francisco. Most of the major opera companies in America folded amid our collapsed national economy. And that would have been the end, except for, interestingly enough, a minority of board members who began collaborating with a number of the major artists, especially the singers who were working at the Met at that time. And they decided to try to fight this, and to fight it by completely reinventing what the Metropolitan Opera would be. Now, a majority of the board members seemed to be passive and perfectly content to let the whole thing go. But the minority eventually took charge. And out of pure crisis desperation, there were 4 radical steps that were implemented over 8 years. And I think you can come up with no greater example of innovation than this. The first of the 4 steps was to convert the Met from a for-profit to a not-for-profit company. And an entirely new tax-exempt entity called the Metropolitan Opera Association, which is still the legal name to this day, bought all the production assets of the Metropolitan Opera and Real Estate Company, meaning the sets, the costumes, the lights, the furniture backstage, everything. The association acquired those assets for the sum of $1. All the productions, $1. The for-profit company retained nothing but the building itself. So the stockholders continued to have their stock, but it related only to the building. Point 2, step 2, create a second not-for-profit in a mission-based civic entity, which was really designed to provide protection to the production company, and this was the Metropolitan Opera Guild. And that was formed as an educational and fundraising wing that was solely to, in effect, redefine the production company, because the idea of a not-for-profit incorporation was not meant for theaters. It was okay for museums, it was okay for symphony orchestras, but even the governor of New York at the time, Herbert Lehman, felt very uneasy that a theater, a producing entity, would go into not-for-profit status. So the whole public profile of the Met had to change, and it had to change very, very quickly in order to justify the tax exemption, and that was the purpose of the Guild. Step 3, strike a deal with NBC and use the then new technology of national radio broadcasts to create a weekly broadcast series in which the intermissions would be used for fundraising. And that's how the broadcasts began. And everything afterwards, from the March of Dimes in the 1950s to your local NPR station's fund drive today, has its antecedent in the Met Opera going on national radio and having a campaign in which they asked every listener to send a quarter. That was the request. And like a lot of examples today in the arts and certainly in politics, all those small contributions from a very large number of donors who were reached through very low cost, all those quarters added up. And it became a very significant amount of money for the Met. And then finally, the fourth step, but this was not realized until 1940, was to have the not-for-profit new association, Metropolitan Opera Association, finally buy out the for-profit stockholders and take possession of the Opera House. And by that time, most of the stock and the boxes were owned by the estates of the original owners. But to give you a sense of how charitable these people were, there were only 4 box holders out of more than 100 boxes that were in the theater at that time. Only 4 were willing to donate their stock to the Metropolitan Opera Association as a charitable contribution. All the rest held out, either for a better price than the association was offering, or to keep it no matter what, because they realized they had stock in a building at Broadway and 39th Street. It finally went to a court arbitration, and it was determined that the building, which was really already antiquated at that point, having been built in 1883, that it was worth about $2 million on the market at that time. And the Met launched a second building campaign on the radio, asking the listeners to contribute again. And it's worth noting that of that ultimately successful $2 million campaign, the largest source of funding that allowed the Metropolitan Opera to buy its building did not come from the Met Board, it didn't come from wealthy individuals, it didn't come from foundations, it didn't come from government, it came from the radio listeners. And that's the foundation on which the Met was able to build. And as soon as the association finally got control of the building, the first thing they did was demolish all but one level of boxes, because originally all the boxes kept going up. They retained one level of boxes, demolished all the others, and replaced them with single seats. And they were then able to increase capacity by hundreds within the same volume. So box office had a gigantic effect on that. So those 4 unprecedented steps of management innovation, essentially convert, create, broadcast, and own, that brought them stability, finally. They still had to go through the deprivations of World War II, and nobody could have predicted that those 4 steps would ultimately work, but they did, and it left the Met in a position, a powerful position, to take advantage of the post-war boom that began in 1945. So that management reinvention, it not only saved the Metropolitan Opera, but it gave, again, if we think about that conversion from for-profit to not-for-profit, it gave legitimacy to the whole idea of a not-for-profit performing arts organization throughout the United States. And the real relevant legacy here is that it was an opera company's reinvention under crisis that established the whole not-for-profit business concept that we take for granted 75 years later, and which is the day-to-day operating mode for American theaters, ballet companies, modern dance companies. We can just go on, and of course it applies to other fields as well. So those 4 steps of management innovation in opera are really a key part of our cultural evolution in the United States. And I'm going to end with just one last point. When the Met imposed its draconian wage cuts in 1932, and staff left, major artists left, there was a fellow named Ernst Lart, who was the Met's chief staff stage director. And on his way out, rather than just go silently, he wrote an article about how he saw backstage conditions at the Met. And there's a statement from that article that's very interesting, and he could have been quoting any number of people who are in this room today in 2019. Lart said, "It's not opera that's dying, only the traditional method of presenting it." And that was 1932. The more things change, right? So let's move on to our 7 provocateurs. As you know from the ground rules, everyone's been given a limit of 273 words, equal to the Gettysburg Address. It's a good system, it works. It's a point of comparison. And each of our provocateurs has really taken time out from very, very busy careers and lives to put some real effort into this. And after the statements, I hope we'll get into a very lively conversation about these contrasting points of view. So since we're here in San Francisco, once again, like yesterday, we have to begin with Matthew as the general director of our host company.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I feel like I should probably be talking about our IPO strategy for San Francisco Opera. That'll come soon. But in the meantime, a few thoughts on innovation. The arts are constantly in flux. The act of artistic creation is an inherently innovative one, with our stages dynamically changing our view of the world. Over the last 15 years or so, seismic shifts in entertainment habits have required us to extend innovative thinking from our stages to our business models, often with a great sense of urgency, even desperation. However, innovation in opera business models must be undertaken with great care for 3 key reasons. First of all, no opera company that I'm aware of has operating profits that can be plowed back into R&D efforts. Innovation jockeys with mission-critical work for funding. How do you balance limited resources for the 2 without compromising either? Secondly, it can take a long time for an opera company to repeat an idea enough to really understand its impact. We have relatively few products each year to begin with, and each product is so different. Confirming truly successful innovations can be a lengthy process, and it's too easy to default to an unscientific gut instinct. And third, the planning cycle of opera can make rapid iteration of ideas difficult. We are innovating change at the same time as planning 3 to 4 years ahead. We're trying to append models that we must, at the same time, perpetuate. All this means that for resource-tight opera companies, innovation must be incredibly purposeful. It should address the most critical issues that our companies are facing. It should be something that, if successful, can be replicated, sustained, and scaled. Otherwise, don't waste resources on it. And if it's successful, what else in the organization can you stop doing to make way for it? Innovation for opera companies requires a very focused mindset, a commitment to quickly moving past innovations that don't move the needle, and a willingness to jettison ideas old and new, even if they're good, to make room for what is successful. We have an absolute imperative to innovate, but let's make sure we're innovating with purpose.
Annie.
Hi, I'm Annie Burridge, the General Director and CEO of Austin Opera. And while I do think we have seen some sparks, perhaps, of managerial innovation over the past decade or so, we certainly all agree that we've seen some thrilling new work and new art created over the past decade. I think that our core value and the core value of our industry has remained the same, and that core value is not innovation. I think that core value is preservation. And so for the vast majority of our stakeholders, our trustees, our donors, our longtime attendees, Preserving this art form and the experience in which we consume this art form is the top priority. And for the most part, change and innovation are only welcome when they are in service to preserving the core experience we have offered for decades. Because of this core value, our institutions, in my opinion, are not currently set up for large-scale innovation. And for it to be possible, we would need to see a massive amount of resources flood into the field awarding innovation. So resources vast enough to literally bury the anxieties of my stakeholders in cash, cover them in cash. And I think, in all seriousness, I think a case can be made that this was one of the key drivers for the surge in new American opera over the past decade. A lot of money was pumped into the system from foundations and from major philanthropists that reduced the perceived risk of doing something new. And so if we could simulate that swell and direct it at the infrastructure surrounding our art, we should be able to achieve more in the area of innovation. But I still think it would need to be accompanied by a shift in that core value of preservation. So for those of us who are administrators, I think there's two things that we should consider. And first is to address this value of preservation, look it honestly in the face, and ask ourselves, are we as administrators doing ourselves a disservice in the long term by building buy-in for our new ideas and our new initiatives by pointing out how they will enable us to preserve the majority of what we've always been doing? So in other words, are we reinforcing resistance to change in the ways we sell our new ideas? And should we be working harder to sell the value of innovation? And while we may not be set up for large-scale innovation at any one institution, many of us are resourced for some kind of investment in innovation. As an industry, we pride ourselves on getting along really well. I mean, just go down to the bar every night at the conference. We're having a great time. But just imagine if we could build on that collegiality and start to build some more actual trust. So I wonder what would be possible if we truly believed that the mutual benefit of launching a radically new business practice in partnership would be greater than the bragging rights of being the first to market alone.
Roger.
Can I partner with you? Can I be first just to sign on?
Totally trust you, Roger.
Great. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm in. Well, I'm Roger Weitz. I'm Opera Omaha's general director, and so I thought I'd start by asking the audience some provocative questions. I'll say, what percentage of your company's energy and output would you say is devoted to your large-scale productions? And there's, of course, technical and production, artistic, but also the fundraising and the marketing and the PR. And then, I'm guessing you might say 75%, 80%, maybe more. But then I'd ask, what percentage of your annual budget each year is supported by ticket sales to those large-scale productions? And that number may be 20%, 25%, maybe less than 20%. So I'm not suggesting that we can or we should produce opera with only 20% of our company's attention, but we're a field that's both reliant on philanthropy and we're also often accused of being elitist. So I think it's a must that we focus more energy on serving those that either can't afford or who choose not, for whatever reason, to attend our performances, our large-scale productions. So what innovations might be possible if we thought of ourselves as cultural resources for our communities and not just opera companies? So these questions at Opera Omaha led us to two major innovations in the last 2 years. The Holland Community Opera Fellowship is an artist residency program that's rooted in the tenets of civic practice. The Holland Fellows are engaged in a diverse cross-section of the Omaha metro area. They're co-creating programming with social service agencies, in-school and after-school programs, and health practitioners. The second major initiative is our relatively new annual One Festival, which features more free events than ticketed performances. Our festival programming breaks with all kinds of operatic stereotypes, and we partner with venues and organizations all across the city. I'll say I'm so glad there's so many trustees here at the conference, and congratulations on doubling, I think, the number of trustees here compared to last year. because all of this work, sort of the idea of transforming your company from an opera company into a cultural resource, can only be done if administrators and boards and stakeholders are all on the same page. Very lucky that that's the case in Omaha. So, thank you.
Alexis?
Hi, everyone. I do not work for the opera. And I think that's why I'm on this board, is to bring a different perspective. So I work at Auguste Public. We're an agile transformation partner to some of Fortune 500 companies like Pepsi and Colgate. We work with nonprofits and government institutions and groups to help them transform their management and administrative practices. And our work is based upon the notion that there is an old way of operating a business that is largely came about during the industrial age and the turn of the century, when we began to have hierarchies, rigid hierarchies of managers. And we benefited a lot from that structure, right? We got specialization. People were able to specialize in what they were best at without having to think about the larger organization. We got uniformity and quality. We got a unity of direction, because you have one sort of loud voice or a set of loud voices at the top that were giving out orders to the rest of the organization, right? That operating structure, for the vast majority of organizations that we work with, is no longer serving them. The operating structure that we see thriving today is much flatter, much more networked, and power is distributed from the very tops of the organization into the hands of those who are doing the work. And I have two examples of this. The first is I worked at Zappos, which is an online shoe retailer. Has anybody ever bought shoes from Zappos here? Familiar? There you go. Good. We were an innovative, a culture-first sort of organization that was running into our own structure as a barrier for the culture that we wanted and the innovation that we wanted to see. And so in 2014, made the decision to embrace self-management. A specific brand of self-management called holacracy, but we embraced this self-management and essentially got rid of all managers and titles in the entire 1,500 person organization. Pretty provocative, right? And what we learned from that is that no one leader owns the market on good ideas. And it is increasingly impossible for us to expect leaders in a world where data and information are coming at us from all angles, for leaders to always have the best ideas, right? Leaders have to be architects to encourage their teams, right, and empower their teams to act on the information and data that they're getting, right, as they execute the work, right? Another pop culture example would be Me Too. There was no manager of the Me Too movement, right? There was no central operating structure that is command and control, right, for everything that happened, and yet it was powerful and continues to be powerful. Often we use this quote in our work. It's from David Packard, one half of HP, and he said, "More organizations die of indigestion than starvation." You know what I mean? Right? It's not that the opportunities aren't out there. It's not that we're not sensing those opportunities or those data points don't exist, but are we organized internally to marshal the resources around those opportunities when we see them? Are we too slow? Is our decision making too slow in order to do that, right? So how can we as organizations become more agile and distribute the power and authority from a few places in the organization that may be bottlenecking progress or innovation into the hands of those who have access to the best data about what is going on in our world and what our work requires? And that's my provocation. Good job. Thank you.
I'm Lisa Middleton, and I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Communications at Lyric Opera of Chicago. And I might be the odd man out on this panel, because I fundamentally disagree that administration lacks creativity or that innovation has stalled. There's never been a time in my career that has required me to be thinking more about innovation as much as I do on a daily basis. We knew that Lyric needed to change, and we weren't about to sit around waiting for something to happen to us. We started with an organization-wide operational assessment, looking at all departments, all expense lines, looking for expense and personnel efficiencies. And then we next looked at revenue and audience growth generating opportunities. The outcome was a redefinement of our business model, and Lyric had, we organized ourselves into lines of business and centers of expertise. Our centers of expertise like marketing, IT, finance, HR are there to focus on providing skills, abilities, and support to the lines of business, opera, our Broadway musical, Lyric Unlimited, presentations and events, and our training center, the Ryan Opera Center. Just the idea that we recognized that we needed new product lines and new ways to support our opera season and financially support the season as a whole is an indication that our leadership and our board is forward-thinking and embraces change. We do not have a marketing committee at Lyric. It was one of the selling points for me joining Lyric. We have a board-led innovation committee called Lyric Labs. It's been in existence for 6 years before the buzzword innovation was a buzzword. Speaking specifically to Lyric's marketing team, because I always think you should speak about what you know, we have fundamentally moved from a communications-focused subscriptions promotions team to an integrated multi-channel digital-first selling machine. And I thought I had 273 minutes to give you my provocation. So I listed all the things we've changed in the last 5 years. But I won't bore you with that. I'm sure we'll have lots of time to talk about it. So what I did was put together what I think innovation requires at a company. And I think it's 3 primary factors. And if you don't have them, it's going to make innovation really hard. You need people resources. You don't need a huge staff, but you do need people that value innovation and creativity and who are excited about embracing best practices, new technology, and that believe the status quo is not good enough. You can't achieve innovation when you're spending all of your energy on making the case for change. You need people who have their running shoes on and are enthusiastic about evolving and learning new things. Secondly, you'll need what I call financial resource, but that doesn't necessarily mean money. Much of what we've done through pro bono work, through negotiation, grant support, and savings from decisions of what we've made, what decisions we've made of what to let go in order to move forward. And then lastly, you need leadership at the company and the board level who understands that all innovation comes with some inherent risk, and every test isn't going to be a success. But there will be learning, and it will ultimately all be better for it.
Hi, my name is Michael Gregor. I'm also with Auguste Public, another outsider here to the opera industry. Our company has worked with SF Opera in the past. I am a leadership development consultant and an organization designer, and what I want to talk about today is the personal work of busting the status quo. I'm assuming we're here because we're interested in changing something about the status quo. And you know, as I've done organizational development consulting for the last 10 years, something I've noticed is that transformation starts with the self. Or another way to put it is that innovation begins from within. We can't transform our organizations. We can't change drastically how teams work. We can't change how structures work or how systems work without first starting with our own experience and assumptions and mindsets. So I want to offer a few things for you to think about and for you to act on, and these apply to any room of people that aim to create something great. So transformation often creates anxiety or fear. It's not necessarily the most easy process, especially in large-scale transformation. And I've worked with a number of leaders and staff people over these years to really support their own personal work. You know, many of our words and our actions at work and in other parts of our lives are driven by fear. Fear of maybe being judged, of upsetting our colleagues, of losing my job, of really rocking the boat. Anyone ever feel those fears? Experience that? Perhaps a universal experience at work? Those things matter. They are our human tendencies. You know, that's our first place to go. But we know intellectually that those things can block us from really achieving what we want to achieve or creating the organizations we want to create. So what I want to offer you today is, what if, with practice, your default reaction to fear became curiosity? Can you feel into your fear? Can you offer it some love and compassion? Then can you bring to it curiosity? What is this? Where is this coming from? What could I learn from this? And if you pair that curiosity with purpose, you might get courage. So why are you in this business? What impact do you want this art to have in the world? Why do you care about the future of opera? If you don't have compelling answers to those questions, probably not the industry for you right now, right? But if you do, or you can create really compelling answers to those questions, use them to fuel your purpose. Use them to help yourself step out of the comfort zone, to go out on a limb, or as one of my friends likes to call it, to walk out onto the bendy branches of the tree, where things are like unstable and shaky and uncertain. Use your purpose to openly disagree with your boss, to initiate a conversation with a leader, a board member, an administrator that nobody else wants to have, to try new things that make your colleagues uncomfortable, to question your own assumptions, your own training, and maybe even to listen to somebody that you really don't like working with. So FDR once said, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear." And in this case, it's that purpose that we can keep coming back to. So with that purpose and with approaching our fear with curiosity, those two things can sort of lead us through the personal work to get to the external work of transforming organizations, which often is breaking the things that have to be broken in order to build the new, which is kind of what the story that Rob opened with is about. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay. Sarah.
Thank you. It's always a bit unnerving to go last because you're worried, like, are they going to say every single thing I had on my provocation? But thankfully, I think I have a couple of new ones. I tend to be pretty practical. I'm a consultant, and a lot of people who come to work with us are working on some sort of problem, or we might even call it a crisis. But we also get to see very high-performing organizations, and we can look at the conditions that created that. And I want to say that for me, the number one thing that empowers people to take risks and pursue innovation is unrestricted net assets that can be devoted to this purpose. So the organizations that can test new ideas and learn from them, each of them has amassed a certain amount of unrestricted net assets, specifically saved, squirreled away if necessary, and replenished after investing so that they can invest in their own new ideas. The problem with the donor and grant cycle process, if you have to go through that in order to innovate, is first of all, you have to convince someone of the validity and value of something before you've even done it, tested it, or tried it. And often you have to wait for extremely long grant cycles that make it impossible to take advantage of market opportunities. So it's almost impossible to seize the day. So the thing to do is have your own kitty to invest and develop an expectation within your organization that spending it is a good thing, not a bad thing. So,
I think one of the common threads.
wait a second.
Oh,
I
you're
have
not finished?
some
Oh,
more
excuse me.
to say.
I apologize.
Wait a
I apologize.
Just because I'm last. I mean,
See, it's the applause that
so
threw me.
then I think it's just absolutely true that the risk of failure in marketing and fundraising is just less well accepted. That artistic risk is somehow honorable, but screwing up and having an empty house or an empty purse because your fundraising strategy failed is just not as well honored. And I think that we see in the innovation grants some attempt to address this, but it's really challenging, and it's a shift in mindset. And then the third thing I wanted to just put out there is I think software is a problem. That software is also siloed, and the structure of systems that allow us to do our work, especially the bigger you get, contains certain kinds of problems that make it very difficult to collaborate across departments. So if we had bigger IT staffs to do more innovation around the underlying systems, we might be able to do something about the fact that all CRM systems look at life as though they're a little bit on the way through a purchase funnel, and they might have other ways to innovate. Now, by the way, I do a lot of consulting in the journalism field, and they have all the same problems as opera companies, and it's a really great place to look for innovation. They have journalism tech conferences and all kinds of awards and ways to think about how the publishing cycle and the software that supports advertising and subscription needs to change. And one of my metaphors for how difficult it is to change a system like a symphony orchestra and opera company is, what is the underlying clock? Some of you know I spent some time in radio, and radio is very clock-driven. I mean, if there's dead air, alarms go off, and bad things happen, and if you run over whatever was programmed to talk, we'll start talking over you. So if you go on to, for example, the NPR website, the clock is there, it's highly structured, a news story can only be a certain length of time, and it's down to the second, it's all timed. Think what's happened with podcasts. Podcasts represent an audio production world that's been completely liberated from any clock. If you have 5 minutes to say, great. If you have 3 hours to say, great, and everything is okay, and the public is consuming this material rapidly, and to good effect for the creativity of audio production. It's one of the most creative fields right now in existence. So with that, I shall leave.
Okay. Final applause.
I think a common thread through all of this is that all 7 statements boil down to people, one way or another. Inspiring people, communicating with people, whether it's departments, our staff, boards, artists, audiences, whether it's community outreach or scope of productions and how people respond to different scopes. And one thing that I frequently see in organizations, at least from a New York perspective, is that all these people will not necessarily define change the same way. And like a situation that I find is very common is that a manager, an artistic director, is brought in to be an agent of change in an organization. And change begins. And then maybe a manager or a board member or the board says, whoa, that's not the change we had in mind. And how do you, as important managers in very, very complex organizations, because no matter how small an opera company might be, it's still a very complex organization. How do you create a unified concept of change from top to bottom through an organization? And let me, before you answer, I just want to say I hope that our conversation will be conversational, and it's not just point A to point B. And I encourage interruptions. I once had a wonderful board chairman named Marvin Kaufman, and we actually published a small red pamphlet, The Sayings of Chairman Marvin. And one of Marvin's statements was, if I don't interrupt, how do you know I'm listening? And it's a very good line. So
priceless.
I encourage interruptions. But I'm going to come back to my question now. How do you create unified change across a very, very complex organization?
Well, I think in response to the story you led with, I mean, the most effective way we've seen throughout history is a crisis, right? Because people tend to get on the same page really quickly, or just, through your example, just scatter and get off the page. And so, but the challenge is much more difficult when there isn't that unified sense of urgency, that if we keep doing the same thing, it will spell disaster. And that is what makes our jobs so complex. I would say we try to start with kind of a shared sense of values and what we stand for as an organization, get on the same page around that, and then build a strategy that pushes it forward. But it's a constant act of reinforcing, of reminding, of revisiting that with every internal and external stakeholder. It's exhausting.
Roger.
Well, I think if the change can happen from the inside out, that is very helpful. So I'll go back to our new fellows program, for example. The fellows are staff members. They have space in the office. It's actually right in the middle of the office. The Holland fellows actually are the ones that kick off each staff meeting with an exercise that they've been working on out in the community. Also, from the board perspective, the fellowship created a new community volunteer body called the Community Artist Panel, which represents a lot of these different partner organizations across many different sectors to help advise this new program. And we changed the bylaws of the board so that ex officio, one member of the Community Artist Panel is a board member, voting board member. So that change is happening from that inside out as well. And then everyone's, it's there, it's all present.
And who ultimately gets to define what you mean by change or innovation? You can have a lot of disagreement. Who's the one who finally says, this is what we mean?
Well, I think one of the things that, I think to the point about the kind of information support for innovation, companies don't generally have a lot of data capacity, or our data capacity is very limited. So what should really be defining what's successful is the data. Is this actually a successful innovation, or do we just think it is? And somehow as an industry, we have to find a better way to deal with data. And again, it's tricky when you're trying to innovate, say, on the actual performance experience, but you only have a limited number of performances. Like a symphony orchestra doing movie night of the symphony, they may do 5 of them a year. They at least have some replicability they can attach to that. I mean, I think to your point, Annie, other ways across the field that we can partner to actually combine that kind of data, but that should really be what's deciding. It's not what we feel is a good idea, it's what actually is a good idea.
Smart.
Yes.
Sure. I don't know that it's possible to get everybody on the same page 100%. I've never seen it happen before in many years of doing this. Some people optimize for different things in their lives. Some people optimize for security and stability. Some people optimize for risk and for innovation. And when we work with organizations, I told you about the Zappos example. A few years into that transformation, there was a moment where we had to say, you've been doing this for a while now. You know the direction that we're headed. If you're not invested in that, or if that's not for you, you can take an offer and leave, a really lucrative offer and leave. And about 240 individuals did. So I don't know that it's possible. I'll return to that. And I think that's okay. And I think that's part of the decision-making calculus. And rather than focusing on the idea that everybody's going to be on the same page and we're going to get everybody aligned, I think we have to focus more on the mechanisms of how we validate new ideas and how we make decisions together, rather than putting all of our eggs in the basket of one innovation or one idea. Focus on how do you make decisions. When you sense something new, what decision-making calculus do you apply to that? Is it full consensus? Does the board have to 100% agree on something, or are you able to try something different, like a safe enough to try model or an iterate model, which you were talking about, trying, iterating, and failing? And I think when you strengthen those muscles, that's the stuff that gets people on the same page, because they see that ideas are being treated equally and are subject to the same criteria and the same rigor, rather than trying to sell everybody on one single idea of what innovation should be or could be for your organization.
I think we have a kind of challenge as an industry, and we've experienced this certainly as we've worked to develop our innovation muscles, is that our industry tends to be predicated on perfection. Yes. You know, we are an industry in which 1,000 different things have to happen at exactly the right moment in order for that curtain to go up and the right thing to be on stage. And so, and that mindset runs deep, and it has to run deep for that thing to work. And so you've really got to kind of at least just acknowledge that, I think, as a company, and then say, how do you work within that to be able then to be comfortable with iteration and failure? And I remember we did one of our first things we did with Stanford D School was what eventually became our pop-up series in clubs and so forth. And we did a session with the Adler Fellows, and I was talking to them about, this is a real chance for experimentation, like this is the one place you can really just fail and feel good about it. And they just looked at me with horror. There's like this idea that we could be allowing them to fail or encouraging them to fail was just so anathema. And that was kind of a real kind of light bulb moment of, how do you reconcile those two worlds?
Now, Alexis, part of what you're talking about, I think, is creating a kind of holistic institutional agility.
Yes.
Right? Can I use that word?
Yes.
Right. Now, how do you take that concept and apply it to a highly unionized field like opera? Where does organized labor fit into that holistic approach?
Yeah, my background is in public education. I ran for office and was on the Nevada State Board of Education for a few years. I was a high school teacher and worked in education administration, which is also a highly unionized environment. And I think the key to innovation is focusing on empowerment as the thread that gets everybody on board, which is it's not about introducing new work or introducing more work or everybody working harder, but the idea that there will be a true meritocracy of ideas, that they will be subject to the same rigor, and that commands will not be coming down from on high to impact you in your work, but rather collectively we will work together to come up with the right things to focus our energy and our time and our limited resources on, rather than me deciding up here that this is the right thing for you to do. And I think that sense of camaraderie and collaboration and openness and a commitment to transparency in a way that a lot of organizations don't operate, that can be a real point of unity when you're going through these kinds of transformations. Yeah, it's hard though. I won't say it's easy.
Can I just add to that?
Yes.
You bring up unionized environments or CBAs, but we're talking about administration, which is largely not unionized and isn't held to those same rules and regulations. And we need to be thinking about change for moving the organization forward. And that can happen in marketing, in development, in HR, in IT, in all the administrative areas that can help the company then fund better art in the end.
But if we look at an institution holistically, is it possible to focus on everything but the unionized forces that we work with? Don't they have to be included in the examination of what this holistic approach should be?
I think it depends on what kind of change we're talking about.
Okay. And Michael, I'm curious, in your progression from fear to courage, and I'm going to mention the reason why I'm asking about this, is it possible to have our partners in organized labor be part of that progression? And the reason why I ask is that I spent 2 years recently on a total failure in New York on a project that would have created far greater opportunities for live music for dance in New York City. And Local 802, the musicians union, could not have been a better partner in this. Absolutely, the union wanted to do something fantastic, but fantastic. And were fully collaborative, worked hard on it, and we couldn't raise the money. And some of the dance managers who were part of this effort said it was the single most difficult thing that they had ever attempted to raise money for. And what ultimately killed us is that the funders were willing to hear us out. But at the end of the day, they didn't really believe that the union was going to do what it promised to do.
Oh, wow.
Lack of trust.
And it was a lack of trust, exactly right. It was a lack of trust, even though we did everything, including the union leaders coming with us to the funders, all the rest of it. They could not have been better partners in trying to launch this project because they wanted to do something both for their membership and they understood some of the issues that the dance companies were, and frankly, we thought, you know, if we can make this work, maybe this is phase one, maybe we can apply this to opera later on, down the line. We got nowhere. But I think one of the lessons for me coming out of this was the need, the real need in a constructive way to include organized labor in a lot of issues with a different approach. So that's really why I'm focusing on this. But we are we're a labor field. I don't think we can just put it off into a box. So how do you get some of these, how do you further implement that progression towards courage?
Before I get there, I want to just confirm, through that experience of failure, you learned something.
Oh, yeah.
That you might apply to something else in the future, right? So that is like the value of failure. And if we look at our actions as, did we learn something from it, rather than was it successful, it's like a different tone and a different way to evaluate what we do. So that's one sort of, some language around how you might honor failure. What do we learn from it? But to your question, I think it's, your instinct is right on to look at the holistic picture. And these relationships matter, as you all know. And I think whatever you can do to create a more participatory environment, what ways can you bring together administration and unionized artists, right? What ways can you share ideas? Can you create ideas? Can you create that meritocracy of ideas? And then create the space and the culture where people are safe to share ideas, even if they're bad ideas, right? Like, every leader in this room has the opportunity to react to ideas. And how you react matters, right? And how my peers react matters. And yeah, it's about creating safety to participate, safety to speak up, and rewarding that.
I have a question. In these negotiations, when you brought the union leaders into these fundraising conversations, did any of the potential funders express their lack of trust in the union to complete the work?
Not to their faces.
I think maybe that's what you're saying, is like creating an environment where what could, maybe moving forward, what can you do to create an environment where those tensions are fodder for that discussion in that room right there, in a productive way that isn't just like mudslinging and I don't trust you, right? And like that's hard because as humans, when we get any sort of sniff of tension or something we don't agree with, our instinct is to run away. Like go home and tell your spouse how crazy this person was that came to talk to you today for money was, but do not tell him to his face that you didn't believe him, right? And I think the more that we can be willing to confront tension productively in the moment with a set of skills that gives us some safety that it's not gonna end in like people screaming at each other, right? The more we can surface and deal with those issues rather than letting them linger. And that conversation, the conversation you never had out loud, the conversation that you knew that they were having in their head but that nobody ever said, doesn't get surfaced.
They were very welcoming. They were very welcoming. But when it was all over, And we went back to the funders to really find out what was going on. I mean, I'm a funder, so these were my own colleagues.
Your people.
It was only then that it came out. Everybody heard us out. Everybody welcomed 802 to the table.
Yeah.
It was only later that we got a sense of distrust.
Yeah.
Not during the process.
One thing that people might be interested in is the field of psychological safety, which is essentially what we're talking about. And it is proven in organizations that like the single most way to predict the effectiveness of a team is their psychological safety. The researchers, thank you. There are researchers that study that in teams, and it's about saying what's really on your mind. It's about giving honest feedback, saying when you don't believe something, right? It's an openness.
Now,
Is that trust?
no, please, right.
Yes.
That's trust.
Yes. It's another word, yes.
Now, another
Well,
subset of agility, or
I was
Matthew,
going to say,
go
like,
ahead.
the innovation work that one can do in a company, I think, actually can welcome in that psychological safety, because by default, you're doing things without expectations built in around, or even jurisdictions built in. And so we've had some wonderful examples where we've brought together people in the company and just people sign up irrespective of where they are in the company, and they all get in a room together. And not only are you bringing many mindsets to a particular issue, but you're also creating a space in which people who may see each other and have seen each other for years or decades even are actually now sitting around a table talking about the same thing. So I think there's a really fabulous opportunity with innovation to be able to create that sense of safety and togetherness, where the idea that there are sort of lines between labor and non-labor go away, because at the end of the day, we're all part of that company. So.
Now, another subset of agility is to take all the departments that Lisa mentioned, and the purpose of it all is to create opera and to have an extraordinary performance on stage. And how does the impulse for innovation, for change, for management vision lead to greater agility in the actual production of opera in our companies, whether it's this rebalancing of large productions versus small, new work versus preservation? I'm one of these people that everybody talks to. And I hear from singers, I hear from directors, I hear from conductors. They all cross paths with me for whatever reason. And if there's any,
scoop.
excuse me?
You got the inside scoop, all the dirt.
If
people
there's
are-
any,
Also,
if
you're
there's
a
any
funder.
common ground in all this, it's that everybody talks about time, and how in the United States we never have enough time to do the proper job of putting opera on stage. A conductor was saying to me that in his European career, it's very unusual for him to not have 3 full orchestral dresses. In America, he gets 1. And I noticed yesterday how moved everybody seemed to be when Daniel Kramer talked about what he wanted to achieve in an upcoming production and his connection to an audience. And my immediate thought was to think, well, how do you pull that off with 3 weeks rehearsal and 1 orchestral dress? How do you get to where he wants to go, given the process we have? And yet the
Piles of cash.
Piles of cash.
the impulse of change and innovation is to get to that point, right? So as managers and department heads, how does it all translate to the process of creating American opera on stage?
Right. I would say get the innovation portion up on the front end, not in the final dress rehearsal. You know, that's a very expensive place to be innovating.
Yes.
So spend a huge amount of time up front having conversations, doodling, drawing, getting it right at the point of time when all you're talking about is the price of a piece of paper. I mean, sure, it'd be fabulous if we had 3 orchestral dresses, but in the absence of that economic model, I think you can really still have incredible creativity. You just have to make sure that you're putting that in on the front end. And if you don't, then you have to pay for it on the back end.
But I think if you're ever sitting through, the last production meeting after your final dress rehearsal, and you've got all your department heads there, and like that's it. There's no more rehearsal. Opening night is coming. Yeah. I mean, if you want to see innovation and agility and creative thinking, I mean, go to that meeting at midnight. I mean, that culture absolutely exists within our unionized forces. So it's real.
Now, do we need a crisis in order to spark this level of change? Is that a necessary step?
I mean, a common enemy helps, right? I think to your point, Annie, earlier, a common enemy always helps get people on the same page. But I mean, no, you don't, right? I don't think everybody needs a burning platform to
So can small steps be as powerful as big steps?
Yes, and we talk about this all the time because everybody's obsessed with transformation and transformation and transformation, and incrementalism has lost its sheen, you know? And I think there's a real, like, that is what we mean when we say innovate. It means about iterating. It means incremental wins. It means not solving the problem, but getting one step closer to solving the problem every day. And I think embracing that means that you're embracing a culture of innovation instead of one innovation that's going to save us all.
Now, one of Sarah's credits is that she has a former affiliation with the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra.
It's true.
And the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra has done astonishing things in trying to reinvent its whole structure of concerts. It's basically cannibalized its earned income in order to generate operating surpluses. And it's been one of the most inventive managements in the United States. And in all of this, Sarah, I'm curious, what's your perspective, having worked for the organization and seeing how all this change in the Twin Cities for the orchestra, some of it has worked, some of it has not, but it's been incredibly adventurous, and it was sparked by the crisis of a labor incident, right?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that the orchestra itself was founded in opposition to something, which was in opposition to the structure of the major orchestra in town, which is the Minnesota Orchestra. It was artist-founded by Dennis Russell Davies. They wore blue velvet suits and had the audience sit on the floor and performed a lot of contemporary music and did things that were not like a symphony orchestra. And I think that kind of DNA helps an organization change as time passes. What Rob is talking about is, well, there have been, as in every environment perhaps, there have been a series of musician board management conflicts there and periods of stronger and weaker financial health. And a dynamic leader, Bruce Kopic, who some of you may know, really wanted to try to solve this kind of once and for all, and he had a vision for let's look afresh at what it would take to have full halls, riveting performances, and unrestricted revenue. Yes, what a winning combination of factors. And at the time, the audience was small. The performances, in his mind, I won't say the words myself as an audience member, but were lackluster, and revenue was lagging. So it really was a plan across all three fronts to try to think of a different way of doing business. And one of the original insights that came out of a business model task force is that more people hearing the music is existentially better than fewer people hearing it. So let's maximize for audience. And contributed revenue is limitless, whereas earned revenue, especially from tickets, is limited. So let's also maximize for philanthropy. So they made the move to drastically, before I worked there, to drastically reduce ticket prices and also expand the number of venues that the orchestra was performing in, which, you know, when you're a chamber orchestra is a little easier than for some other kinds of performing arts. But all the tickets are $25 or $10, and then a huge emphasis on increasing the annual fund. And then while I was there, we also added another layer, which is we created a concert membership program, which I'm a member of for $10 a month, year-round, I can attend any concert for which there are open tickets. And all I have to do is call the box office and say I want to go, and I can get in. Then if you make a contribution in addition to that of at least $300, you have a concierge inside the organization who will help you get your tickets. And there weren't enough concierges on the staff, so everybody on the staff, almost every single person, became one of these concierges, which it sounds cumbersome, but really ticket holders don't have that many demands, and there were 30 of us. I think there are now around 1,800 members. And at a time when Group 1 orchestras overall, during the time period where they've lost 15% of their subscribers, the chamber orchestras had only a 1% decline if you include the members and the subscribers. And furthermore, people who attend 3 times or more per year are more than twice as likely to contribute philanthropically. So the annual fund has grown at a time when that's not so much happening, as you all know. This sounds, there's no silver bullet. We used to call it pick and shovel work. Like every one of these annual fund increases, this is a lot of nitty-gritty, data-oriented work, but it has really helped the orchestra thrive over the past 15 years.
Let's talk a little bit about boards. Do they tend to accelerate or slow innovation?
The audience has an opinion.
There's a certain level of embarrassment to that laughter. Who's willing to jump in?
Well, I can
Lisa.
just jump in and talk about Innovation Committee, because I think it's fairly unique at Lyric, and for opera companies to not have a marketing committee. In my past, asked if we were on Facebook and did we think about sending emails and such. Like, the Innovation Committee is there to challenge us to come up with ideas that may or may not work. And it was called Innovation Committee. It's now called Lyric Labs, and that was sort of an intentional change. And we don't have a lack of ideas on our team and at our company. What we have is a lack of time and resources. And so by having the committee and by having risk capital being put up by a donor, it's allowed us that opportunity to try new things, invest in new ways in which to sell tickets, invest in our website, et cetera. It's given us that ability to actually do these iterative changes. They're not all huge. Some, in the future might be larger than they are today, but that iterative change also frees up time and resource so that you can focus on something larger. But that committee of the board, recognizing the fact that risk capital needed to be put up, has not only created a fund, which is the Innovation Fund, it's actually given a pool of ideas to the fundraising team to then go out and fundraise for as well.
And for those committees, do they accept being led by the professionals within the company, or are they taking the perspective of success from their own careers, from their own fields, and applying it to a not-for-profit organization where perhaps that connection shouldn't be made? Because I've seen this in a number of organizations in New York where people who are grounded, very successfully grounded in financial services, will have a concept of how a not-for-profit should be run. And it usually takes about 1.5 years for that to play out, and those board members discover, I guess a hedge fund is not a not-for-profit. They are different organizations, and the not-for-profit does require a different kind of leadership and a different perspective. So I'm always interested in how that intersection is created over aspects of change and innovation between professional managers and the board.
I think it depends on the committee. So Innovation Committee, led by staff, give us some feedback. Finance Committee, completely different story. That's the hedge fund. I run a company. They have one person on their marketing team. I have one person on my marketing team, and so you should do everything you do with one person on your marketing team.
Roger, you've been
I
nodding
was
that,
just
yeah.
going to say, I think yes, and also the board leadership if the executive director, general director, board president sort of relationship is key, and if you have board leadership that really understands and agrees that change is necessary or the change that you're advocating for, then that's the best possible advocate, because peer-to-peer at the board really helps.
But this issue of the kind of the pile of cash is in a way the critical piece, because I mean, to have the innovation fund, to have money set aside, kind of really becomes critical. Otherwise, you're basically using the same resources and the same human capital to try and innovate while you are at the same time trying to execute something. And you know, we have a really fabulous class of nonprofits here in San Francisco that are not healthcare companies or arts companies or education. They're companies like Uber and Twitter. And I mean, these companies that are making no profits at the moment, but they have so much energy behind them that people are pouring money into them with the belief that, you know, they can grow, they can scale, they can do really exciting things. And so, I mean, I'm fascinated for us, like, how do we take some of that mindset? I mean, we may not be at a place where we can scale and take over the world, but the innovative mindset of, we trust you as a company to go ahead and do bold things. Here's money that you can use for that without necessarily a purpose or an end goal in mind. Just go and, you know, go and create.
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, wait, you're supposed
You
to.
were listening.
Oh yeah, I was listening so closely.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. What you just brought up about the model that we're all exposed to here, Twitter, for example, is similar to coaching that we give a lot of the organizations that we work with, which is about strategy. And the strategy that Twitter or an Uber is using is growth even over profit. When both of those things are things that you want, they're both amazing things, and it would make sense to flip that at some point, right? But it's a trade-off, and strategy should tell us not just what we're doing, but what we're not going to do, so that we can create margin to do this other thing really well. And so a lot of times when we do strategic planning as an organization, or we set goals and we give people strategy, what we're really giving them is a bunch of great things that are just goals. Like, we want growth, and we want audience, and we want funding, and we want this. And I think some discipline around these, what we call even over strategies, which is like, even if it's just for a period of a week or a month or a quarter or 6 months, being really explicit that in these next 6 months, we're gonna focus on audience even over, like, growing our audience even over meeting our budget goals. And like, that is a message that's coming from the leadership, coming from the board, and that everybody then can make their decisions using that heuristic. I think that's really important.
When you have an organizational strategy that's clear, that's when you can get all 15 or all 1,500 of your team members to make decisions in real time, whether they're on the phone with a patron or in a meeting with a trustee, to make a decision that advances that strategy. And then things can move so quickly.
We call it a pre-alignment without the pre-alignment meeting. Like, when your strategies are right, and they have clearly articulated the trade-offs that you are willing to make, people can make decisions in the moment with so much more clarity and speed than having to run that up and make sure that it's okay with everybody.
Now, Anna, in your statement, you said that sometimes we're not completely honest in really looking at what stakeholders might want, how this is applied to an audience and others. And I just wanted you to elaborate on that a little bit.
Did I say we're not honest?
I think that's the word you used.
Who's not honest?
That in examining the way our audiences, funders, others would look at what they really want on stage, what they're really expecting from an opera company.
I think that as a field, we are pretty aware of that, and we have worked quite hard to base that assessment on information as opposed to just intuition or what we've always felt. The honesty I was trying to conjure in my statement is really trying to get very honest with myself as an administrator in trying to find the way that water's going to run down through the rocks to get to where we need to go? Am I taking some shortcuts? And the path of least resistance is to point out that change and innovation is all in service of preservation, even if that's not the core belief behind driving what I think needs to change.
Now, most opera companies, not all, but most, are in urban environments. And urban environments have lots of different arts organizations. What happens when one company's major initiative bumps up against somebody else's core mission? So that, Lisa, you mentioned the annual musical that has been very successful for lyric opera, right? The Goodman Theater in Chicago also does musicals. In Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Opera has had to deal one way or another with the LA Philharmonic doing staged opera. This is happening in New York. The New York Philharmonic has some very ambitious operatic plans in the works. How, within the arts landscape of a given community, again, what happens when point A's major initiative bumps up against the core mission down the street?
Well, we should be anticipating that and building partnership, building trust. I mean, there are enough resources in these community to support a lot of this work, and I just this stance of, you know, that's my territory, I do opera, you're not welcome, doesn't get anybody anywhere. You know, we've taken all the small, tiny operas that are in Austin, kind of all the indie places, and we're like, hey, we market what they do. We sponsor their productions. We opened our rehearsal hall to them for free. I mean, we know the research has shown us that the more people who consume opera, the more people who consume opera, right? So anyone, like anything that happens anywhere, no, it's the truth, right? Like, I'm not even evangelizing. We've actually shown that through research. And so my take on that is that, you know, anything that anybody does in my town that could convince one person that Austin, Texas is an opera town, like, that's hugely beneficial to me. And so I just think that's the only way to look at it, to move the field forward.
I would just agree wholeheartedly. I think it's fantastic that the Goodman Theater's doing musicals and that we're doing musicals. It's expanding the audience for all of us. And it is going to ultimately lead to bigger audiences overall. And we know wholeheartedly that musical is the #1 lead generator for opera audiences for lyric. And the numbers show it. They're humongous. We just closed West Side Story. We sold over 110,000 tickets to West Side Story. You know, we know 58% of them were new. We know 20% of them will come to the opera next year.
And within your own conversations, amid your colleagues in the Chicago community, are there issues that come out of that for the larger art scene in Chicago? It's very successful for lyric opera, of course, that's unquestioned. But I'm thinking about the position of an opera company or a symphony orchestra, frankly, in the reverse situation. What are the lines that come out of that in terms of the collegiality of a field, if there is such a thing?
I think we're incredibly collegial. I think we all get a bigger audience as a result of it, and we have more arts attendance in the city of Chicago, and that's great for all of us.
A famous line of Mahler's is that tradition is your last bad performance. And just to build a little bit out of something that Matthew said, if we could be specific about it, because you talked about things that need to be discarded. What are the inherited practices in opera that seem destructive in 2019?
You know, I think talking about things being discarded, I mean, we've just gone through some big changes in San Francisco. But it's not because the things that we are moving on past were bad things. It's that we need resources for other things, or we don't have resources for those things. I mean, things like Opera Vision up in the balcony, for example. It's a fabulous thing. But for us to continue it would mean for us to reinvest in a brand new media suite. Do we put millions of dollars into that, or do we put millions of dollars into something else? And so I think for me, it's more where the priorities lie for the organization in that moment and what programs and priorities support that. And not being afraid as an organization to say that things can be temporal and do not have to be permanent. So it's less of a value judgment about was it a good or a bad thing, and more just, is that the best thing for this moment in time? And if not, then it's okay to switch.
And what about for the mid-sized companies like Omaha and Austin?
Well, I think as much as the change can be additive, and so you're not taking away something from someone, and so our festival is all about exploring new venues and formats and times of day, and have a drink and bring the drink with you and sit down and come and go as you like. And part of our festival was commissioning Ellen Reed, amazing composer, for a sound sculpture, and she had this vision of a playground that makes music as it's played on. It's interactive, and that was a part of our festival. But it's additive. It doesn't mean we're taking away Carmen and Bohème, and so it's as much as possible, and that takes time. But administratives, at least in this country, are not union, so maybe administrative time is less expensive than union time. And all these new initiatives that we started, took about 2.5 years to plan before they were ready to go, and that gave us time to build the resources and make it additive.
Additive's always easier, for sure. But there is a finite world of resources and time, and I think that's what Matthew spoke to with such maturity, is the difficulty of deciding when some things need to be discarded in service of others. And so I think just having the discipline to constantly revisit, why do we do this? Why do we have this affinity group? What is their purpose? And create a safe space where we can talk about that and discuss how maybe that purpose has shifted is helpful for us.
I think this is another opportunity for participation as broadly as possible. I bet that every staff member could think of something that could be discarded, right? Like if you asked. Because people, especially at the edges of an organization, they know what feels like, why are we doing this still? Or this feels like a waste of time, or there's got to be a better way that saves time or money. So what can leaders do to make it safe for people to raise their hand and say that? Because, like Alexis said, leaders cannot possibly see everything happening in the organization. So part of it is sensing and building the capacity of the whole organization to sense, like, what doesn't make sense anymore to do? Both from the little minutia, also up to the big stuff.
We only have 2 minutes to go. So I'm going to end with a kind of lightning round here.
Oh, no.
It won't be so bad, I promise you. But I think we'll start in reverse. We'll start with Sarah. But I have it's an easy question. Because it's just summarizing what we've been talking about. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. If you could just name one single building block that's the most important institutional component of innovation, what would that be?
Single most.
One fundamental building block for institutional innovation.
I'm going to go with Michael's trust. If you don't trust each other, it's very hard to take risks, whether those risks are stopping something or trying something.
Michael?
Shifting a decision-making model from, is this the perfect thing to do, to, is this safe enough to try, knowing that we will learn from it. Different mindset.
Lisa?
Data.
Yes.
One more.
Alexis?
Oh my gosh, Michael, you took mine. The single biggest building block in innovation is the willingness to let go, however uncomfortable it might be, whether that be of your control over something, and a lot of times it is willingness to let go of your control, or perfection.
Roger?
I'd say a commitment to being a force for good in your community. And I'll just add something a funder told me who said, philanthropy for this particular person is an investment in the community, and the community expects a return on that investment.
Annie?
I will echo Lisa and say data. I've learned a lot from Lisa over the years, but building that out a bit, creating a practice in which decisions are made more on data, less on emotion and ego.
And we end with Matthew. We began, and we end.
I'd say human capital and respecting that innovation requires time and space for people to think, and you can't just add it onto someone's existing profile.
Alexis said we have to let go, and we have run out of time. So I want to thank everyone and thank all of you.
Please join us in thanking Rob Marx and all our panelists. Our next session starts at 3:30 p.m. Please join us for refreshments in the True Linked exhibit hall on both